banning Russian oil and gas. US President Joe Biden said the move's aimed at hitting the main artery of Russia's economy. But what are the consequences for the rest of the world? And will it stop Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finighan. US President Joe Biden has imposed a ban on Russian oil and gas, and the UK announced that it will phase out imports of Russian oil by the end of the year. Before those measures were announced, Russia warned of catastrophic consequences for the global economy. Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett reports.
It's a major escalation of U.S. economic sanctions against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. On Tuesday, U.S. President Joe Biden went after President Vladimir Putin's most lucrative industry.
We're banning all imports of Russian oil and gas and energy. That means Russian oil will no longer be acceptable at U.S. ports, and the American people will deal another powerful blow to Putin's war machine.
The decision by President Biden to ban Russian energy imports into the United States follows pressure by the U.S. Congress and pleas by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Biden acknowledged the latest sanctions could cause a spike in U.S. gas prices. Consumers are already paying on average more than $4 a gallon, up from $2.77 just a year ago, due to high inflation as the economy recovers from the COVID pandemic.
Since Putin began his military buildup on Ukrainian borders, just since then, the price of the gas at the pump in America went up 75 cents. And with this action, it's going to go up further.
The White House is directing the release of some of the U.S. strategic petroleum reserves to contain prices and compensate for lost supply. But the White House maintains high gas prices might also encourage U.S. consumers to switch to green energy and electric vehicles. But this analyst says the United States is nowhere near ready.
The biggest user of oil in any country is transportation. And transportation depends on having things like electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. Those vehicles represent a relatively small part of the fleet. The fleet turns over slowly, so the green economy, we're talking about years.
That's why these latest U.S. economic sanctions against Russia may be symbolic, designed to hurt Putin financially, but mostly politically. President Biden is sending his Vice President Kamala Harris to Poland and Romania this week to reinforce support for Ukraine, but also to reassure nervous allies, fearful that Russia could turn its aggression on them next. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, the White House.
It's clear that gas prices affect our economy. I drive a lot. I put many kilometers in, and I do feel it.
Absurd. 15 days ago, nobody could think about it. The problem is not the price it will be tomorrow, but how much it will cost in 15 days. I think bad times are coming, but we will have to deal with it.
My purchasing power will decrease. I will have to choose between using the car or doing other things.
Well, we'll bring in our guest in just a moment, but first let's take a closer look at Russia's role in the energy industry. Russia is a commodities powerhouse. It produces more than 10% of the world's oil and natural gas, and Europe relies on it for a third of its gas. But sanctioning this sector would send energy prices surging even higher, affecting an already fragile world economy. With Russia being a major global supplier, it could also mean more profit for Russia, not less. The US and its allies have agreed to release 60 million barrels of oil reserves to help offset any shortages, although the world consumes 100 million barrels every day. And analysts say that no oil-producing countries can replace Russia's oil exports to Europe. Let's bring in our guests then. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Ben Cahill, a senior fellow Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. From Bern, Cornelia Meyer is an economist and CEO of the consulting firm Meyer Resources. And from Moscow, Leonid Savin chief editor of geopolitica.ru and a political analyst. A warm welcome to you all. Ben, let's start from you about how the EU got itself into this mess. It relies upon Russia for what? Something like 27% of its oil imports, around 15% of its total consumption. Why is then Europe so dependent upon Russian oil, and could any other supplier replace it quickly?
Well, thanks. It's good to be with you today. This is partly just a matter of geography. It's proximity. The continent is connected to Russia by pipeline systems. We have the Druzhba pipeline, which is the main export pipeline from Russia into Europe, reaches lots of countries through both the northern and southern arm. And we have a lot of seaborne exports that go to Europe as well. So Europe is the critical export market for natural gas and for oil for Russia. If you look at crude oil specifically, about 60% of Russia's exports go to Europe, about 35% to Asia, primarily China, and the rest to different places around the world. And so in terms of whether or not Europe can diversify and find an alternative to Russia, the answer is no. In the immediate term, it's just not possible. The European Commission came out with an emergency plan yesterday, basically to try to do everything possible by next winter to reduce its dependence on Russia for natural gas supplies, including building gas storage, trying to find alternative supplies from US LNG and other supply sources, and managing the demand side too. But it's really difficult. It's important that Europe has a sense of urgency. It's moving fast, but it's not something you can do within a year.
All right, Cornelia, I see you nodding in agreement. In terms of oil, what about countries like Venezuela with its vast reserves? The US has opened up diplomatic channels again with Caracas recently, or even Iran. Negotiations there appearing to head towards a conclusion over the nuclear deal if sanctions against Iran were lifted. Could those two countries, for instance, at least help to plug the gap?
They can't plug the gap because if you take out Russia exports 8 million barrels a day, that's 8% of global daily consumption. And so they can't, and you have seen that OPEC plus, the OPEC countries and their 10 allies, which by the way are led by Russia, really can't pump it fast enough, and the spare capacity is really spare. It's really sparse. It's not there except for Saudi, UAE, and a little bit of Iraq. So that's difficult. Now let us look at Venezuela. Yes, obviously they can go and talk to Venezuela, and the Venezuelans may actually be receptive to talking to them, because so far when they were under sanctions from the US, the Russians have been their only friends. But they're obviously worried that if money dries up in Russia, what will happen to them? They need those direct payments. But PDVSA, the national oil company, is woefully underinvested, and it's just, it's no longer, it used to be one of the shining lights in the oil industry. It's now very much near the bottom as a player. So it can't just ramp it up like that. And Iran, similarly, Iran could bring in 1.2, 1.3 million barrels a day if the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, went through. They have a lot in storage, which they can release immediately, the 1.2, 1.3 million barrels a day of exports. They will take more time. But mind you, the JCPOA is negotiated by the P5, the permanent 5 of the UN Security Council, and Germany, P5+1. Guess what? Russia is a member of the P5.
So why can't OPEC step in and pump more oil?
Well, OPEC can step in to a certain degree, but OPEC doesn't have, as I said before, it doesn't have the spare capacity. Let me give you an example. They have cut out 9.7 million barrels a day after that grim day in April 2020 when WTI went negative for a day. And they've released gradually 400,000 barrels a day, month on month on month. But if I look at the numbers for January, they were supposed to pump the 13 nations 400 incremental barrels. They only were able to pump 160,000 barrels. Now, again, Saudi can do more. Russia was constrained. And you look at Libya, Nigeria, they just can't keep up.
Ben, the de facto leaders of Saudi Arabia and the UAE have declined to arrange calls with President Biden in recent weeks. That's according to the Wall Street Journal, citing US and Middle East officials. What's going on there?
I think that Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are in no mood to do favors for Washington. They're making political demands. They're trying to use their leverage at the moment. If we look back to last week, OPEC Plus had a meeting, right after the war broke out, and that meeting lasted for all of 13 minutes. And they basically decided to continue the deal that Cornelia just mentioned, which is to add 400,000 barrels a day into the market and continue what they've been doing since last April. I think there were several reasons for this. First, it's going to take a while still from today to absorb the magnitude of the supply shock from Russia. We still have a lot of questions about the physical disruption and how big it is exactly. But I also think that the issues around spare capacity are real. This price surge has been so big, there's so much fear and panic in the oil market now, that I think some of the OPEC Plus states are concerned that, if they add more production for a month or two, it's not really going to make a big difference. But I do think that the political pressure on OPEC Plus is going to intensify. This is a serious supply shock. And OPEC's stated role is to manage volatility in the market and prevent volatility. It feels like the market doesn't have anyone at the wheel right now. And it feels like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others are ignoring the demands of big consumers, not just the United States, but countries like China and India as well. So I think in the coming days, lots of things are possible. It's possible you'll have, a revision of the OPEC Plus terms in next month's meeting. You could see a unilateral move by Saudi Arabia, but clearly they want to get some concessions from Washington before they do those things.
Okay, let's bring in Leonid then in Moscow. Good to have you with us, Leonid. What does a US and UK ban on Russian oil really mean for Russia, its economy, its president? Will it hurt either?
No, for Russia it's not a problem, and if United States and UK, or for example European Union, will stop to buy Russian oil, because it's not so big part of Russian economy, and we have already deal with China to provide more oil to this country for next year. We have a new contract signed this year, and I think it's more problematic for United States and UK. And because there was first shoot in our leg by United States when they imposed sanctions against Iran and Venezuela. And now we see that technical opportunity in Venezuela is broken by American sanctions. And they just cannot to provide more oil to United States, for example, if there will be political decision. And of course, there is also option about natural gas. And it's more dangerous for European economy than for Russia. And for example, now price for diesel inside of Russia is more cheaper than before because of sanctions. And it's good for development of domestic economics of Russia. So for the moment, I see no serious problem for Russia itself because of this oil sanctions.
Okay, what if the EU were to follow the US and the UK's lead and ban imports of Russian oil and Russian gas? I can see already that Cornelia is shaking her head. I'll come back to you in a moment. But would that worry Moscow?
I am sure that European countries, most of European Union, cannot to find alternative of Russian gas and oil, because half of European Union countries strongly depends of Russian supplies. It's not only Nord Stream 1, but it's also oil production, and it's some kind of logistic. It will be a chain reaction and will deeply impact on European economic itself. So I think they will try to find alternative in a few years, but at the same time Russia will find alternative for new market in Asian part of the world. For example, China, India, and Pakistan, and more countries who have energy hunger and will look for Russian gas and oil. And maybe it will be more cheaper because of this situation. But for now, we see that prices for gas and oil growing up, and it's seriously impacted on European and United States citizens because your community, I mean the community of United States, of European country, are economic-centric communities, not like in Russia. it's a very serious mistake to see Russia the same like of United States and, for example, Germany or France. We have another type of community. So it's a very big difference, and will be more a problem for the West itself.
Okay, Cornelia, tell me why then. Why won't the US, the EU rather, follow the US and the UK?
It's two things here. You need to decide. You need to divide between oil and gas. If you have oil, it will always find a market. And you saw that at the beginning of last week when Russian cargoes had a hard time finding a market. The Chinese and the Indians just waited until the discount was low enough and they bought it. So that will go. Gas is more difficult because it requires infrastructure. And our Russian colleague was absolutely right. It's not a light switch. You know, if we want to get, let's say, more LNG in, most LNG is on 25-year contracts, and especially the Middle Eastern and the Asian cargoes are promised on these. The molecules are promised to China, Japan, and Korea. If you talk to some of the analysts, they say 10% could get diverted to Europe. The US, similarly, they will have about 12 million tons of new LNG coming on the market in about 5 years' time. I think we need to heat houses in Europe before the 5 years' time. Plus, you need the infrastructure, you need the regasification terminals. We don't have enough of them, and the infrastructure linking them into the pipeline system. So again, it's not a light switch. It really takes time. And again, oil is easier, but it's also not that easy, because don't forget that refiners are tuned to certain grades. So if they really are an old refinery that's very dependent on the Urals grade will have a hard time just substituting it. So it looks easy, and I'm sure to the politician it is easy, but to the guy in the industry, it's hellishly complex.
Ben, what are the political risks of banning Russian oil and gas for Western leaders? Does it threaten to split the West's currently fairly united response to Russia's actions in Ukraine?
I mean, the economic risks are huge. If you impose the full sanctions on Russian energy exports, that's a recipe for a recession. It just is not possible for the oil market to accommodate a loss of that kind of magnitude. And this is the reason why we haven't seen direct sanctions yet. Even with, sanctions on just the Russian central bank, Russian financial institutions, other Russian entities, we've already seen a big supply loss. No one knows exactly how much is offline now, but it's a good bet that around 2.53 million barrels a day of crude and products are already offline today, even without direct sanctions. If you ramp that up to 8 million barrels a day, all Russian exports, there's simply no way for the market to cope with a loss on that scale. And so the prices would shoot up. It would be a severe dent to economic activity. The market would panic. That's a recipe for demand destruction. It would be unmanageable, I think. So I think there are clearly huge downside risks to doing it.
Leonid, President Putin has called sanctions, he's referred to sanctions as an act of war. To what extent do you think he would be prepared to perhaps preempt further Western bans and just simply cut off supply anyway?
I think Russia is ready for trade in future with United States, with European Union, and Mr. Putin before told many times that we are ready for cooperation and need to make difference between different type of economics, politics, etc. So in ultimate reason, I think that Russia, yes, can to impose counter sanctions against United States and European Union and to cut gas on all the supplies to these countries if there will be some very serious impact on the Russian economy in future. But now in near a few months, I see no any danger for Russian economics from the energy sector.
Cornelia, we're talking about the economic damage that a sustained high oil price could do. There's the old saying that the best cure for a high price is a high price. If demand fell, as consumers just decide that it's too expensive, then so would the price. But at what economic cost?
Well, at a huge economic cost. And, obviously we'll see some demand destruction, but our economies are still fueled by oil and gas, and by the way, coal. You know, if the Germans, let's say, go off gas, they will need some coal. You need some base loaders to keep the lights on. So that's a huge cost. And, you know, the cost goes beyond those countries. You saw the German economy minister and deputy chancellor say, if we get off Russian gas, immediately he fears for cohesion in the country. And the man, Robert Habeck, is a green. He is no fan of fossil fuels. And what goes beyond that, if we see hyperinflation, that's not good for the economy, global economy. And also don't forget food, because Ukraine and Russia make up about 30% of sort of the global food supply. The Ukraine is 50% of the World Food Program food supply. So, you know, the developing countries, the Sudans, the Somalias of this world will really feel that, because they won't get the grain, and they won't, even if they get it, they won't be able to afford it. Plus the fertilizers. Gas is the direct input to fertilizers. Let's take Germany as an example. Out of 3 major suppliers of fertilizer, 2 are Russian. So we're really, really very interconnected.
Ben, I was reading today that the biggest strategic gas storage reservoir in Western Europe is in Germany, and that strategic reservoir is owned by a subsidiary of Gazprom. Germany, in particular, of course, worried about its energy security, while prices may rise uncomfortably for US consumers. I mean, there's little chance of the lights going out in the US. I don't think the same could be said for many Western European states. To what extent does Germany have only itself to blame due to deregulation of its energy sector, allowing Russian companies to hold or own significant stakes in German energy companies? And Germany's not alone in that, is it?
Yeah, there have been some pretty important changes in the European gas market in recent years. I mean, they've basically moved away from, you know, long-term oil-linked contracts towards more gas-on-gas competition, more reliance on, you know, the spot market short-term. And that worked pretty well for a while. And, you know, the market is essentially broken in the last 6 months. I mean, we've had these enormous run-ups in gas and electricity prices in Europe. You know, the dependence on Russia is really hard to break. But there are some European policies that I think have exacerbated this situation. One of the things that the International Energy Agency and the Europeans have noted is that they really need to have an all-out effort from now until next winter to build up gas storage as much as possible to fill all those tanks. And it's going to be extremely expensive for them to do that. And gas supplies are scarce. I mean, basically, LNG producers around the world are producing full tilt. And as I think Cornelia mentioned earlier, you know, not every country in Europe has an LNG import terminal. Those that do have regas terminals, regasification terminals, they're not connected to all those markets. So all of them are going to have to try to refill gas as much as possible. You know, they can't completely get around their dependence on Russia to do that. They're still going to be dependent on Gazprom, but they'll do everything that they can to build interconnections, to increase gas storage. And I think they're really going to have to look at gas policies and try to figure out why this market in Europe has gone so haywire and what they can do to build more resilience in the next year.
Leonid, you think that President Putin is prepared to sit this out while the West potentially shoots itself in the foot economically and causes a huge economic damage to itself?
I think that Russia is preparing for different type of sanctions. Also, our Prime Minister, Mr. Mishustin, already told that we have calculated risks about different type of sanctions from the West. So I think more sanctions will be more dangerous for European Union and the United States, because Russia will impose more sanctions. We should talk about not only oil gas sector, and also about food, fertilizers, like colleague told recently, and about, for example, that airspace of Russia is closed for companies from European Union, and there is also different types of sanctions that Russia introduced against European assets inside Russia, about capitals, etc. So yes, it's kind of war by other means, and geoeconomically, I think it will be more serious damage for some European countries than for Russia.
Okay, there, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it Many thanks indeed to you all for discussing that with us here today. Ben Cahill in Washington, Cornelia Meyer in Bern, and in Moscow, Leonid Savin. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget you can see the program again at any time just by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion around this topic, join us at our Facebook page. You'll find that at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter. I handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian, Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.